Okay, so we're recording now. Thank you so much for joining
My
and
pleasure.
sharing your expertise. Today we're here to talk about China-Africa relations, but also more specifically, now Canada's strategy for Africa as it relates to as I say, the 2063 agenda from the African Union. As an expert who works in government in Canada, also an expert in these types of relations, we've invited you on to speak a little bit about this strategy, a little bit about this new document, and share other ideas. If you could introduce yourself, introduce your company, that would be great.
Thank you, Tyler, for having me on your radio show. So my name is Oluwatobi Ogundele, and I'll just start off by saying that I do not represent the government of Canada in any capacity. So I'll just issue that disclaimer that for the rest of the conversation, the views I express here are mine, my own opinions, and they do not represent the Competition Bureau where I work. So just to give you a snapshot of my experience, so I'm an economist by training. I have a master's degree in economics and a bachelor's in economics. I also have a master's degree in international public policy, and my specialization is international economic relations and global governance. And on the side, I lead the team at Economics Africa, where we conduct just African policy journalism and research. By day, I work as a competition law officer at the Competition Bureau of Canada, and I've had previous experience in South Africa in a similar agency. And I also worked at SIF, it's another arm of government, it's the Strategic Innovation Fund, another arm of the government of Canada. So I guess my interests are really in policy and economics and how those two intersect because I strongly believe that effective policies have very, good outcomes for citizens of any country.
That's great, and thank you for the introduction. And I know today it's a little bit shorter, about half hour, so we'll get right into it. There's a couple of questions that we presented before, and we're just going to go through them quickly and just have a loose conversation about that. Um, Number one, let's just talk about, so what is this? Canada's updating its approach to engagement on the continent. And do we feel like this is a response to what is happening with China, what is happening with the States?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, interestingly, in the past few years for Africa, there's been that growing influence of China on the continent. And it's true for most of the African countries because as at last year, China had actually had almost 40 bilateral trade agreements with different African countries. So, and there's this really interesting piece of data from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So they actually have annual data on FDIs that flow to Africa from China. So there's, that increasing influence from that perspective, which has, both positive and negative impact. But back to your question on Canada. So on the global front, and just narrowing down to Canada, previously, Canada's relationship with Africa has been very humanitarian focused. So lots of aid in the security afflicted areas of the continent. But more recently, the country is diversifying its engagement and it's more of like an economic partnership now that Canada is looking towards and the role that Africa can have in kind of helping Canada diversify its markets, especially, since, and I'm sure you've heard this news about Canada's southern neighbor, the US has levied some very serious import tariffs on
Yeah.
Canada. And also since the US, so previously the US has had it's still in place until September at least, the AGOA. So AGOA is Africa's Growth and Opportunity Act, which was something that had been in place since 2020, if I'm right, and it really just helps uh, tariff-free exports from African countries to US. So there's kind of uncertainty as to whether the president of the US will keep that going. So in the face of all this, I mean, for African countries, for Canada, there's the opportunity to ensure that there are kind of stronger trade relationships. And someone might hear me saying this and think Canada has never traded with African countries. That is not true. There's always been trade with Canada, but it's been very limited. I mean, the figures for 2023 show that imports from Africa to Canada less about 2%. And that 2% is literally merging African figures with the Middle East figures. So if we kind of dissect that further, maybe African exports to Canada is probably 1%. So Africa does trade with Canada, but it's been kind of limited. So this new engagement, this new approach to engagement will hopefully ensure there's more trade across, both the continent and Canada.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all feel so subject to these tariffs. It's brought a new force of nationalism in the country for some reason, even to the point where products, specific name brands, are boycotted. Do you feel, just as a fun question, do you feel that there's key African products? Do you feel like the manufacturing sector there is capable enough to have a larger footprint or even a footprint in the general consumer relationship with a Canadian going to the grocery store? Because right now, you want a specialized product from a certain country, you might have to go to an African goods store, an imported store. But how will this, as you see it, maybe encourage a larger swath of products and a larger swath of relations coming from Africa to Canada?
I mean, that's a great question. And if I had to comment, you kind of cut off earlier, so I didn't get the full picture, but I think I got some bits here and there.
No.
But to try to answer that question about the manufacturing capacity, right, of African countries, was that it?
Mm-hmm.
I think that was it.
Yeah.
So, well, that's an interesting question because I actually wrote a blog, I think 2 years ago, on Economics Africa about the need for trade facilitation mechanisms. And one of the points I made there was just the current trade infrastructure in Africa and the limited capacity the continent has to kind of embody and allow advanced manufacturing. So, and that kind of tallies with how we do trade in Africa with the rest of the world. So trade has majorly been primary export based. It's usually, gold to the Middle East, crude oil to other parts of the world, and those get refined and sent back to the continent. And, for this Canada-Africa strategy to work, there's expectations from Canada, there's expectations from the African countries. But, just to say in summary, as it stands, only if, business as usual becomes business unusual. As it stands, this trade infrastructure in African countries, and I'm talking of just road networks, just advanced food processing, how you can preserve, for example, tomatoes, transform them to other, useful food products, tomato paste and all that. It's happening in African countries. It's just very limited. So the ability to kind of jump on that now as it stands is, it's infeasible in my opinion. But a lot can be done to kind of change that dynamic, and it depends on the kind of investments that African countries begin to make to prepare, to be able to supply what the Canadian populace would like to have.
Yeah, it's a really interesting train of thought when we're considering looking at numbers in trade, percentages, and then thinking about what the actual product is. Because obviously, throughout the course of history of globalization and neocolonization, all roads lead out. Depending on what is being given to other countries and whether these deals are quote-unquote fair or what we imagine the actual needs are of the people domestically in terms of what the agreement is at a higher level and if that trickles down. I think this really leads into the next question, because a lot of people are concerned with growing attention in the continent, and it's mineral rich. It's the richest place in the world. However, they have been under. I mean, manufacturing industrialization has been underutilized, and maybe even by design. And so, as the continent's home to about 30% of the world's critical minerals, do you feel like this play that Canada is doing is to secure a part of that? Do you also feel like Canada can position itself to build better trade agreements and better investment partnerships?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And I think I may have answered part of this earlier. But so Canada, like I said earlier, does a lot of trade with Canada's trade strategy is very diversified. I mean, with the EU, with the Caribbean countries, even with Africa, even though, like we said earlier, the trade is kind of limited. So, for example, one way Canada is positioning, or probably has been positioning itself to build better trade and investment partnerships, is what Canada has, and it's called the Trade Commissioner Service. So this Trade Commissioner Service kind of helps, because at the end of the day, I mean, the government of Canada is not the one going to do the trade. You do need Canadian private businesses, right, to do that trade, and it's not the government that is the trading partner of any African country. So for the Canadian businesses, the Trade Commissioner Service that Canada has connects, these businesses with funding opportunities, with support, tells them about opportunities in Africa. I think there are 22 Trade Commissioner Services, in Africa from Canada. So those kind of support programs are useful for private businesses, and I think those will expand going forward with the Canada Africa strategy. Canada also has what you call the FIPAs, the Foreign Investment Promotion and Protection Agreements. Currently, it's only with 7 African countries. The one with Nigeria it's been signed, but it's not in force yet. But what this FIPAs do is just builds like a rules-based framework. So in case there are any disputes, so that certainty in trade is kind of assured, because most countries want to have that certainty that we're partnering with you, and you don't just suddenly like change your mind overnight. So those rules-based frameworks are there that Canada has currently with about 8 African countries. So I'll just say, in my opinion, Canada has been positioned, and even at the multilateral level, so at the African Union engagements that Canada has been having, I think in 2023, they actually appointed a permanent representative from Canada to the African Union. Canada has been supporting the African Development Bank, a very, effective institution. It would seem that the country has been doing a lot, just based on those engagements to position itself to do more trade with the continent.
Very good. Yeah. So the diplomatic infrastructure is building and growing. A
Yeah.
key point to any kind of development program or bilateral relationship between nations is this question of, okay, how do we engage the workforce? How do we secure sustainability long term? And a huge question for that in many countries in Africa is that there's such a youthful population, and there is a potential there to tap into skills, education, job creation. There's just so much that I feel is underutilized currently with these relationships. Is there anything that you feel personally that you could comment on that could help develop these relationships in a way that's youth-led, in a way that's Africa first?
Yeah, I like this question because I think I like the youth. I think I'm still a youth, maybe. But I'll start by saying that, I'm not sure if, Canada's mandate is really to contribute to the skills development of an entire continent. And this might be controversial, but I'll say it anyway. Because that's why African countries kind of have their own elected leaders whose mandate is really to ensure that the labor force is skilled, educated, and globally competitive. That is the mandate of these leaders that Africans vote for or are voted for. But I guess I get the spirit of the question, and I'll answer it I'll kind of answer it loosely in relation to the Canada Africa strategy. And the third strategy kind of touches on the reduction in poverty, supporting economic development, and the part that I kind of like is empowering the youth. And I guess if it's that Canada is looking for a skilled workforce and a way of getting Africans to come to Canada, that will kind of be an immigration question. And, there's the IRCC in Canada to address that. But the other part is, the investment in the youth that you spoke about. And I think there might be two ways of doing that. The first one is, Canada has really advanced technical skills and vocational skills. It's a highly educated population. Canadians are highly educated people. And I think a way of supporting the delivery of those skills in Africa could be by just supporting those vocational programs, training programs, skills programs. There's the possibility of helping out with curriculum development. The other thing is there could be built-in pathways, and there's this thing that exists in that many countries do where they have like student exchange programs where
Yeah.
you have, it's possible that African countries can have their graduates go to selected Canadian universities or institutions, learn, how to engage in advanced manufacturing, pick up those skills for a year, 2 years, and then return to their source country in Africa and kind of like even train others and apply that. So there are many ways to have those, cross exchange, those cross learning opportunities that Canada, of course, in agreement with the African countries, can facilitate.
Yeah, it's such an incredible thing to discuss. There's so many different approaches to this. I mean, when people think about development, they could think about things on a diplomatic level, things on a civil society level, and then really when you're thinking about engaging the future generations, it's about this creative integration of how are our youth going to be contributors to this larger mission that we have. Wait for it to connect a little bit more. Okay, back on. What's the last thing you heard me say?
About the different levels of approaching the issue.
Oh,
So you
yeah.
said the diplomatic, and you were kind of going on.
And then, yeah, civil society, and then there's this large question of how do we creatively engage youth in future building. Um, like it's an interesting thing to think about when you might be a young person who is feeling like the world is interested in your country, interested in what could happen between nations, but then maybe there isn't the proper infrastructure there, creatively, socially, to really capitalize on these relationships. And what you talked about with foreign exchange programs, something personally that I felt pre-COVID in China, in Beijing, there was so many foreign African exchange students there. And I think that small thing, it's not a huge population, but it signals, especially with visas, especially with just visas, passports arrangements, and things like that. These small things signal so much potential to somebody down the line. And if Canada, I feel, can properly communicate that it does want these relationships, it does want these partnerships, it has to include some semblance of a sustainable future for the youth in Canada and in the African nations that they're dealing with. And this is another funny thing because we share so many cultural similarities. I mean, half of the government operates, well, not half of the government, but the government operates in English and in French. Language is a huge component in connecting people. Do you feel like that has anything to do with the strategy right now? Thinking about Francophone Africa, thinking about where culturally we are more similar in terms of history and the history of colonization. Is there anything to be said about that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. Well, I'm not francophone, I'm anglophone. But then
Yeah.
I think so many people may be unaware that of the over 300 million French speakers in the world, almost half of that number reside on the continent of Africa. So it's interesting. You generally think that you find, many French people in France. Of course, there are many French people in France, but a huge percentage of French speakers are actually on the continent. And it's an interesting dynamic with Canada because I spoke about the FIP agreements earlier, and I said there were seven active ones with 7 African countries, right? And of those 7 that are in force, 6 are with French speaking African countries, which kind of gives you an idea of the kind of diplomacy already happening with the continent. And I think there's some kind of comfort level with Canada engaging with Francophone or French speaking African nations, at least from those agreements. But of course, with the Canada Africa strategy, I don't think the government of Canada plans to only deal with African French speaking nations. The AU 2063 vision is for, one Africa. So Canada will continue to, I hope, to engage with both the French speaking and the English speaking nations on an equal or equitable basis. So I think that's kind of how I'll answer that question in a way. Yeah.
All right. Cool. Um, yeah. There's another question that I want to circle back to. Is basically just, I think this might be one of the last questions that we talk about, but it's this kind of competitive nature between states. In terms of global competition, everybody has a strategy, it seems. Is there one strategy that will win? The messaging is similar across the board. So how will they differentiate who's gonna, I guess, come on top, if that's even possible? And why is there fear? Why is there fear within this competition?
Yeah, I think I got a few parts of the question, but I think I get the gist of it, so I'll attempt to answer it. So I guess maybe for putting on my global governance hat here, nations are sovereign, so there's that sovereignty element, and each country is free to kind of have their own strategy depending on how they want to interact with the other countries in the world. So that's absolutely up to the nation concerned. But just looking at, and then you kind of touched on the issue of uniformity of, I'll say, ideology. So it depends. I don't think every nation is exactly the same. So the way US will kind of trade with China or trade with countries in Africa might be slightly different because there are different business terrains. Like we said earlier on, different advancements in trade infrastructure. I mean, even cultural elements are different in different nations. So we're not exactly the same. So I don't necessarily expect that even though the vibe, maybe the strategies kind of aim to achieve the same thing, their implementation will be vastly different. And so even though, most countries will have a trade strategy, want to increase trade relationships with this country, the way that will play out on the ground will be different because of the ideologies of, both parties. So I won't say it's like a competition issue. I'll just say it's that they're trying to compete with each other. I think it's just trying to find out how best to live out each country's reality.
And we full-heartedly believe that this can be achieved through, I mean, at least economically, it is trying to be its most efficient self. Do you think that?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, cool. Maybe the last question that we could really touch upon is just basically about world economy and kind of plugging into what is already there. things are quite volatile in markets in the States right now. Do you feel like a strategy as grand and as far-reaching as this has the necessary buffer, the necessary margins to deal with such volatility?
That's interesting because I think one of the things that even makes it the perfect time is because of this volatility. And we're talking about the Canada Africa strategy now. So I think it's coming out at the perfect time. Some commentators are like, it's long overdue. So it's perfect timing because it's still a strategy. I mean, it's very clear, it's still in the works, it's still a strategy, and strategies need implementation mechanism. So I'm kind of happy it's coming out at this time because when there are five strategies in the Canada Africa strategy document. Permit me to repeat that. And those five strategies, now implementing them can take cognizance of this increased protectionism in the world, of the changes happening. So it's good to have now so that countries concerned can just adopt and kind of adapt to the reality of the US's more protectionist approach to trade. And so it's perfect timing. And just I'm really excited to see how that strategy gets implemented going forward. It will take time, but it's good that it's happening now.
It's interesting that you say it's good that it's happening now. I mean, if countries become more nationalistic and more protective, that's ultimately a good thing in your opinion?
I wouldn't say that as an economist. I think most economists believe in free trade and that nations have comparative advantage in something. Maybe South Africa. South Africa is like the second largest exporter of oranges and many other things. They're really good in cashew nuts and pears and etc. So the basis of free trade is that you can kind of benefit from someone else's expertise in particular products.
Yeah.
So, but we also learn in economics that there are business cycles, there are trade cycles. There's a boom, there's a recession, then there's a boom, there's a recession. So things change. And it's the same with politics and diplomacy as well. Relationships turn sour, like the case with Canada and the US. Best friends for many years, and suddenly things happened, and there's a new president that thinks a different way to achieve certain outcomes for his own citizenry. So I won't say that I'm definitely pro trade. I believe there are the advantages to having that exchange across countries. No one is an island. But then, depending on the leader, and I feel that leaders are elected, right? And it's the voice of the people. So if the people feel at this point, we want someone that will do this because he was elected. I mean, people went to the polling stations and kind of voted for President Trump. So maybe it's the mood of the time. Maybe people want more protectionist approaches to trade, to diplomacy or relationships with other countries. Whatever may have instigated that, we're not unpacking that in this conversation. But then, it's like I said earlier, it's the ideology of the time, things change, and we'll see how that kind of plays out. Maybe it'll be positive or negative. We're all here kind of waiting and watching to see
Yeah.
what happens.
That's a fun way to end it. It's a good thing to say we're just going to see what happens. Do you have, from your professional standpoint, or maybe what you want to have happen, do you think that there's any fun predictions that you could share with us about Canada Africa strategy, China Africa strategy? I'm thinking, okay, within the next 5 years, what do you think is going to happen? What do you want to see happen economically?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. Many economists don't have crystal balls, but people always want economists to make predictions. But so I won't predict because I don't have a crystal ball. But there are things I personally want to happen, and I'll just speak to the Canada Africa strategy. And there are things I don't want to happen. So I'll start with the second point. So what I don't want to happen with the Canada Africa strategy is that in fostering this increased economic relations with African countries, I'm hoping that it won't just be the exports of, raw silica, for example, because there's AI. Many countries are looking for which countries have silica so we can make our semiconductor chips. And I think some huge deposits of this have been found in southern Nigeria, and I think in some other African countries as well. So I don't want the relationship to just be about we're here for the raw material, materials, and we need it for this. But what I would like to happen, and I think maybe for advice to African countries, is just three things. The first thing is, to be prepared for increased trade relationships and to kind of upgrade from our primary export dependence to kind of advanced manufacturing. So, but you can only get there by improving your trade infrastructure. So road networks, rail freights, customs procedures can be very complex in some African countries. So simplifying that, making sure that industrial policies kind of support investments in those kind of, facilitation mechanisms. So that's like the one thing. The other thing I would really like the Canada Africa strategy to facilitate is just the articulation with which African countries, respond to the WTO's Trade Facilitation Agreement of 2017. So that came into effect then, and many African countries, and I'm really impressed by this, have ratified that agreement. But the level of, articulating what the countries need to kind of like have proper trade procedures, just writing that out and their supports for that. I hope the strategy can help improve that. And I guess the last thing is, like I said earlier on, it's not the government of Canada that will come to Africa to trade. Likewise for African countries, for just a friendly business terrain, even for local and indigenous producers that may want to kind of engage in this trade. So Canada is looking to trade with African countries. I want to be part of it. But if it's so hard to register a business, it's so hard for the cost of doing business as an African. A young African wants to start this business. So just having a very friendly, kind of less complicated trade environment is something I would like, African countries to have, and even for Canada as well. The Canadian business environment is heavily regulated. And even if there are private Canadian businesses that want to come to Africa to do business, those businesses will weigh the cost and the benefits of, going out to do business. And they may decide, we're not interested, and just do their local Canadian business that they want to. So just removing those barriers locally, will really help make that Canada Africa flourish. Just from an economic trade perspective. And that strategy is not only about trade. Maybe I should emphasize there are many elements to it. There's a security, conflict, peace, and so many elements to it. And that, can be spoken about. But I'm just kind of talking more towards trade for the purpose of this conversation.
I wanted to ask one more thing just based off what you said. You're talking about a spirit of friendliness and fellowship. Some people might say now that some people might say now that it's more hostile than ever. That things are being said without weight, and people are proposing ideas that they just won't work. Do you see any of this from America? From America's Canada? These are all problems, but do you see any of these problems coming over?
You mean to African countries?
Yeah. Do you see that language? Do you see that attitude? Would that even be possible?
Or do you mean the pessimism? So some people are just pessimistic about the strategy as a whole. That's just like a document that.
Pessimism and also just general feeling of hostility.
Towards the Canadian government. Is that what you mean? I don't know. I think I've seen a few articles where people say, oh, the strategy should have said more. It's not dense enough. We need more, maybe more funding, more money and all that. I don't think I necessarily share that view. I mean, like I said earlier, it's a strategy and strategies need to be implemented. You understand? So you have to have an implementation of a strategy. So I'll say it's a start, and I'm not necessarily pessimistic about it. I think I'm more optimistic about the strategy and just the possibilities that can come out of it. But now the question is that will those possibilities materialize? I mean, will it become reality? And I don't have a crystal ball. I'm hoping it becomes a reality because it'll be to the benefit of Canada and also, to the benefit of African countries. It will really boost trade, across both parties. So I'm not necessarily going to condemn the strategy because that strategy was a result of consultations with, the private sector, with the public sector. So, it's seeing this in that form means that there were lots of conversations and negotiations that happened to bring it to the point it is. But then my only fear, like I said earlier on, is whether African countries are kind of prepared from an infrastructure perspective to kind of engage at the level of trade that we would like that strategy to be at.
Very well said. And thank you for shedding some much needed optimism on the future of trade and development. We
Yeah,
talked
I'm,
about
I'm an
going.
optimist, so
Yeah.
I try to see the glass, it's almost full.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, so much of development commentary is just saying, okay, look, the development programs of the past failed. So what now?
Yeah,
The strategy in the past failed. No, now it's competition. They're taking these things. They're not developing in local people. They're not giving jobs. So what now? And so what now, really? We'll see. And hope that it will get better. And maybe the hostility in the Americas might turn into a friendlier approach elsewhere because we need friendly diplomacy. That will never go out of style, I think.
yeah. In
Yeah.
politics, there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies. Things change.
Yeah, that's great. There's never permanent friends. There's never permanent enemies. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you for joining, and I'm gonna wave goodbye before I stop recording.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Thanks for
and
having
we'll
me.
stay in
All the best.
touch. Yeah, thank you.